I was stopped at a red light on Route 9, maybe 2 miles from my house, when I saw him, my son, my boy, standing on the median strip between the lanes holding a piece of cardboard with words written in black marker. He was wearing the same gray jacket I'd given him 2 Christmases ago, the one with the broken zipper he always said he'd get fixed. His hair was longer than I'd ever seen it, and he was thinner, so much thinner. I sat there with my hands on the wheel and I couldn't move. Cars behind me started honking when the light turned green. I didn't care, I just kept staring at my son, who was begging for money from strangers on a median strip on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I pulled into the parking lot of a CVS and sat in my car for a minute. I'm 63 years old, I've buried my wife. I've run a business for 30 years. I thought I'd seen hard things, I hadn't seen anything like this. I got out and walked back to the median. He didn't see me at first. He was looking at the passing cars with that blank look people get when they've stopped expecting anything. Then he turned and saw me standing there, and I watched something move across his face that I still can't fully describe. It was shame. Yes, but underneath that it was relief, like he'd been holding his breath for a long time and someone finally told him it was okay to exhale. "Where is the house?" I said. "Where is the car I signed over to you?" He opened his mouth, then he closed it. Then he said, "Dad, I can't explain it standing here." "Then get in my car," I said, "and you're going to explain it somewhere else." His name is Nolan. He's 34 years old. He has a mechanical engineering degree from NC State, a work ethic I was proud of for most of his adult life, and a wife named Renata. No, wait. A wife I will refer to only as my daughter-in-law, because using her name right now would make it harder for me to tell this story calmly, and I need to be calm to tell it right. He had met her 4 years before all this happened. She was charming in the way that some people are charming. The kind of charming that functions like a light you can turn on and off. When it was on, you wanted to be near her. When it was off, you tried to remember why you'd thought she was special in the first place. I didn't dislike her. I want to be honest about that. I had some unease I couldn't put into words, but I attributed that to being a father who'd lost his wife and didn't want to lose his son too. I told myself I was being overprotective. I told myself to stay in my lane. They got married 18 months after they met. I paid for the wedding. Not because they asked me to. I offered. My wife and I had saved money over the years with the idea that someday our children would need it for things like this. My daughter was already settled, married to a good man in Portland. Nolan was the one still getting started. So I paid for the wedding, and I smiled in every photograph, and I meant it when I said I hoped they'd be happy. I gave them the house 6 months after the wedding. I want to explain why, because some people hear that and think I was reckless or naive. The house had been my wife's grandmother's. It sat on 2 acres in a quiet part of Guilford County, North Carolina, white clapboard siding, a porch that ran the length of the front, a barn in the back that I'd converted into a workshop years ago. My wife had loved that house. When she died, I couldn't sell it, but I also couldn't make myself live in it. Too many rooms, too many reminders. I was renting it out to a family who was moving on, and Nolan mentioned they were looking for a place, and it seemed like the right thing to do. I signed it over to him properly, with a real estate attorney, the whole process done correctly. I kept the car, a 2019 Silverado pickup that I'd let him drive while I got around in my SUV, and eventually transferred the title to him as well when they had their first child. Their son came along about a year into the marriage. I was at the hospital when he was born. I held him in the delivery room and felt that specific gravity that happens when you hold a new person for the first time. I drove home that night and called my daughter, and we both cried a little, the good kind, the kind that means something is happening that you're grateful to be alive for. I did not know as I was making that drive home that my daughter-in-law's brother was sitting in their kitchen signing documents that would systematically take everything my son had. His name was, I'll call him her brother. He'd moved from out of state shortly before the wedding, which I hadn't thought much about at the time. He'd gotten a job locally, rented an apartment nearby. He'd positioned himself as helpful from the beginning. He drove Nolan to the airport once when his car was in the shop. He helped them move some furniture. He attended the baby shower and bought a nice gift and laughed at everyone's jokes. I had no particular feeling about him one way or another. He was just there. What I learned later, much later, from a private investigator named Samuel Pruitt, who I will get to, was that her brother had been doing this for years, in different states, with different family members of his sister's various relationships. The pattern was always the same. Get close. Get trusted. Wait. The first sign something was wrong came about 8 months after the baby was born. Nolan called me on a Sunday evening and asked if I could help him cover a shortfall in the mortgage. Not on the house I'd given him, but on an investment property he said he'd bought with his wife. I hadn't known about any investment property. I asked him about it and he was vague in a way that made me uncomfortable. He said his wife had handled the details, that it was a good deal, that he'd pay me back in 60 days. I lent him $4,000 because he was my son and I didn't want to make things harder for him than they already seemed. 60 days came and went. I didn't push. I told myself he was under pressure. New baby, new house, figuring out a marriage. I'd had hard years too, and I remembered what it felt like when people gave you a little room. So I gave him room. Then his wife called me, which she almost never did. She said she was worried about Nolan. She said he'd been struggling with anxiety, that he'd been making financial decisions without telling her, that she was scared. She sounded upset in a way that felt real. She asked me if I'd noticed anything different about him. I said I wasn't sure. She said she thought it would help if I gave her access to some of the accounts, just to help monitor things. She said just catch anything before it got worse. She said Nolan had agreed to it. I said I'd think about it. I called Nolan that night. He didn't pick up. I texted him and he answered 2 hours later with a message that said, "Yeah, Dad, it's fine. She's just trying to help." It didn't sit right with me, but I wasn't sure what was wrong with it exactly. I kept turning it over and trying to identify the thing that felt off, and I couldn't. 3 weeks later, Nolan called me and asked if he could come over. He showed up at my door at 9:30 in the morning on a Thursday. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He sat at my kitchen table and he said very quietly, "Dad, I think I've made some mistakes." He told me that his wife and her brother had convinced him to sign a durable power of attorney, giving her brother control over their finances while Nolan focused on work and the baby. He'd signed it in the hospital, 3 days after their son was born, when he was running on no sleep and terror, and the specific vulnerability of new parenthood. He said his wife had cried and told him she just wanted to protect their family. He said her brother had brought the documents and explained everything in calm, reasonable language, and it had seemed at the time like the right thing to do. I put my coffee cup down on the table slowly. I said, "Nolan, a durable power of attorney doesn't just manage finances. That gives someone legal authority to act on your behalf. On everything." He looked at me. He said, "I know that now." The investment property wasn't an investment property. It was a mechanism for funneling money. Her brother had used the power of attorney to take out a home equity line of credit against the house I'd given them. The house I'd signed over in love. The house my wife had loved. The house where my grandson was sleeping in the room we'd painted pale blue together. He'd drawn down most of it and moved it through a series of transfers that a forensic accountant would later describe to me as designed to be difficult to trace. There was a life insurance policy. Her brother, as the person holding power of attorney, had enrolled Nolan in a large whole life policy naming his wife as the 100% beneficiary. Not my grandson, not Nolan's estate, just her. When the forensic accountant showed me that document, I sat with it for a long time. I'm not an emotional man in the demonstrative sense. I don't raise my voice often. But I sat with that document and I understood with a very cold and very clear certainty what they had been planning. I did not tell Nolan what I was thinking. He had the baby to manage and he was already barely holding himself together. I told him to come stay with me for a few days. He said his wife would be upset. I said I didn't particularly care what his wife would be upset about, and he flinched a little, and then he nodded, and he went home to get some things, and he came back that afternoon with the baby in one bag. She called me that evening. She was composed, which I found interesting. She said Nolan was under stress and prone to distortion, and she was worried about him being away from home. She said her brother was only trying to help and that I was interfering. She said if I kept inserting myself, she would make sure things became complicated. I asked her what specifically would become complicated. She paused and then said she was sure I understood what she meant. I said I did and I hung up. That night I called my former business attorney, a man named Patrick Holt, who had handled my company's legal work for 22 years and who had the specific quality of never panicking and never wasting time. I told him everything. He was quiet for a while on the other end of the phone. Then he said, "Ed, we need to move on several things at once, and we need to do it before they realize what we're doing." Ed is my name. I'm telling you that now because that's what he called me, and it felt important to include it. It's the name my wife called me on our best days and my worst ones. It's the name my son called out from the median strip when he was 7 years old and fell off his bicycle and split his knee open and came running to me. I am Ed Mabry, I am 63 years old, and on that phone call with Patrick Holt I was the clearest I had been in months. Here is what happened next, and I'm going to tell it the way it actually unfolded rather than the way it makes sense in retrospect, because that's the honest version. Patrick contacted a forensic accountant first. Her name was Dr. Angela Tran. She came highly recommended and charged accordingly, and I did not hesitate about the cost. She spent 6 days going through the documents Nolan could provide: bank statements, the HELOC paperwork, the power of attorney itself, the insurance policy, and she produced a report that was 22 pages long and read, in places, like a quiet indictment. While Dr. Tran worked, Patrick engaged a private investigator named Samuel Pruitt. Samuel was a former county sheriff's deputy who had moved into private work 15 years ago. He was thorough and unhurried, and he did not share information until he was certain of it, which I respected. He was the one who turned up the history of her brother operating similar schemes. He found 2 prior instances, one in Georgia and one in Tennessee, both involving women his sister had been in relationships with, both involving financial manipulation of their partners, both ending before the legal system could fully catch up. There had not been a third prior instance involving life insurance. Samuel told me that quietly in my kitchen with his notebook open on the table. He said it carefully, the way people say things they know will land hard. I nodded. I said thank you. I went and stood at the kitchen window for a while and watched the yard. Nolan didn't know the full scope of it yet. I kept that from him deliberately. He was managing an infant and his own considerable shock, and I needed him functional. I told him we were addressing the legal issues and that he needed to revoke the power of attorney immediately, which was his right as the grantor and which his wife's brother had apparently assumed he either didn't know or wouldn't do. The revocation was the first move. Patrick filed it formally, with proper service. When her brother received notification, the activity in the accounts, which Dr. Tran had been monitoring through the available records, stopped immediately. That told us he'd been watching. That told us he knew what the revocation meant. He called Nolan 3 times that evening. Nolan didn't answer. The 4th call came from her, his wife, and Nolan picked up. I was in the next room. I could hear her voice through the phone. Not the words, but the tone, which was not the composed tone she'd used with me. It was higher and faster. Nolan came into the kitchen afterward and sat down. He said she'd told him Patrick was scamming him, that I was trying to take control of their marriage, that he needed to come home immediately and fix this. He looked at me. He said she loves me. I said, I know she said that. He said, but the life insurance policy, Dad. That document you showed me. I said, yes. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, okay, what do we do next? What we did next was the part that required patience. Patrick had been in contact with the Guilford County Sheriff's Office and a financial crimes investigator there, a woman named Detective Vargas, who had reviewed Dr. Tran's report and described it as thorough and actionable. She told Patrick that to move forward they needed certain documentation-specific form and that it would take time to assemble the full picture for a prosecutor's office. She was not rushing. She did not want the case to come apart on a procedural detail. I had to accept that the pace was not mine to control, which was the hardest part of all of it. During that waiting period, Nolan's wife moved out of the house on their own accord, taking the furniture, the stroller, several of the baby items, and this is the part that cost me some sleep. Filing an emergency custody motion claiming Nolan had abandoned the family home and was mentally unfit to parent. She had photographs of Nolan from a period several months prior when he'd been visibly stressed, taken without his knowledge. Her brother, presumably, had been advising this next move. Nolan was served the papers on a Wednesday morning. He sat at my kitchen table with them in his hands, and I watched my grown son cry in a way I had not seen since his mother died. He put his forehead down on the table, and I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I used to when he was small and sick, and I didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say right then. What I said later was, Patrick is already on the custody motion. This is a delay tactic and an expensive one, but it is not the end of this. You will not lose your son. He lifted his head and looked at me. He said, how do you know that? I said, because we have the truth and we have the documentation and we have time, and they don't have any of those things. I believed it when I said it. I also said it because he needed to hear it. Both things can be true. The custody motion was addressed swiftly in our favor, in part because Nolan was demonstrably living in a stable home with a capable adult, me, and in part because her attorney, when pressed for specific evidence of unfitness, could not produce any. The motion was denied at the preliminary hearing. Nolan retained shared custody pending the full proceeding. Samuel Pruitt, in the meantime, had located her brother's residence through standard methods and had been conducting legal surveillance. He reported to Patrick that there appeared to be new activity, a vehicle registered in another name, regular meetings with an individual Samuel had identified as a financial advisor with a history of facilitating offshore transfers. Samuel presented this information to Detective Vargas. That was the piece that moved things forward. I don't know the precise sequence of what happened at the legal level, because it is not my area, and because Patrick handled it appropriately and I trusted him to do so. What I know is that on a Thursday morning, 4 months after Nolan had shown up at my door and said he thought he'd made some mistakes, her brother was arrested at his apartment. The charges included financial fraud, theft by deception, and misuse of power of attorney. The investigation was still ongoing, which meant additional charges were possible. He did not go quietly, Samuel told me afterward, but he went. His sister, Nolan's wife, was not arrested that day. The investigation into her involvement was continuing. She retained a criminal defense attorney and, within 48 hours of her brother's arrest, filed for divorce. Patrick said that was not unusual in situations like this, that people in her position often tried to create legal distance from their co-conspirators as quickly as possible. He said we should expect her to claim she hadn't known the full extent of her brother's actions. Nolan was sitting with me when Patrick called to tell us. He had the baby on his lap, the boy who was 10 months old now and who had just recently figured out how to pull himself up to standing by holding onto the edge of the coffee table. He was doing that, pulling himself up and looking pleased about it, while his father sat on my couch and listened to Patrick explain that the man who had systematically tried to destroy his life was in handcuffs. Nolan said, "Thank you, Patrick," and ended the call. He sat for a minute looking at his son. Then he reached over and steadied the boy when he wobbled, and the baby grabbed his finger, and Nolan said very quietly, "Just that. Okay." The house was recovered. The HELOC was part of the fraud case, and the proceeds were subject to restitution proceedings. Trans documentation made the financial trail clear enough that the court had sufficient basis to act. It took another 8 months of legal process that I will not detail because it would try your patience and mine. But the house came back. The home my wife's grandmother had built. The porch where wife used to read on summer evenings, the pale blue room where my grandsons slept, it came back. The life insurance policy was cancelled. The irony of that particular document being voided through the same legal mechanisms it was designed to circumvent was not lost on me, though I allowed myself only a small moment of satisfaction about it, because I am not a person who likes to dwell in things like that. Nolan and his son live in that house now. I helped him get it into shape. There was some deferred maintenance that had accumulated during the period when he hadn't had the headspace or the money to deal with it. We spent a weekend in the spring, replacing the gutters and repainting the front porch. My grandson sat in a portable chair in the yard and watched us with great seriousness, which I found encouraging. His mother, Nolan's wife, entered a plea agreement. Her cooperation with the investigation into her brother's prior activities in other states was part of the negotiation. I don't know the final terms, and I don't particularly want to. Patrick told me the outcome was fair, and I took him at his word. I think about the red light on Route 9 sometimes, the way the afternoon light was hitting the median strip, the way my son was holding that piece of cardboard and not looking at anyone in particular. I think about what would have happened if that light had been green, if I'd been 2 seconds earlier or 2 seconds later, if I'd been on a different road. I believe that some things happen when they're supposed to happen, and I believe that belief is not naive but is in fact the result of having lived long enough to see how certain things connect. My wife would have said the same thing in different words. She was better at the words than I am. What I know is this. My son asked me once when he was very young what I would do if he was ever really in trouble. "I mean really in trouble, Dad," he said. I told him I'd come find him. I told him I didn't care what the trouble was or where he was. I would come find him. He remembered that conversation when I walked up to him on the median strip. He told me so later. He said it was the first thing he thought of when he turned and saw me standing there. I came to find him. That's all. Some things are exactly that simple, and they're also the hardest things there are.